Social media has changed the way organizations communicate with the public in many different aspects. Internally, I'm noticing a lot of NGOs are being quite innovative in terms of recruitment, HR practices, and internal communications, and making sure that all their employees, regardless of different locations, are getting the same information and are up to speed on the messages that the NGO wants to be consistent about. Externally, social media, as we all know, is exceptionally important because it allows an NGO to affordably communicate messages and scale that around the world. And the only barrier now is language.
Social media has definitely in the last few years become one of those big buzzwords in the charitable sector, and I think the challenge now for Canadian nonprofits is that they understand that they have to be on that channel, that they have to communicate in that way, but still it's such a new channel that a lot of the best practices, we're kind of guessing at things. We're looking at industry to see what things worked, we're looking at case studies, but it's still also new that everyone's sort of figuring it out together. So what's cool about that is that it's sort of a level playing field.
The biggest change is that it's less about broadcasting messages out and waiting to see how they're being received. Dialogue, perhaps overused in the social media space these days, has become the norm. So we're not waiting to see how people are reacting to things that we're saying. We're often reacting to what's being said about us organically by people who are just communicating with each other. Sometimes they're talking to us, sometimes they're talking about us.
The evolution of social media over the last few years, the biggest change has been the fact that organizations now do have to communicate with the public, not just to the public. I think it's a really well phrased question. Organizations now have to listen to what the public is saying, because just projecting your message isn't enough anymore, because people are going to answer back and you're going to be forced to listen.
So in terms of how it's changed how organizations communicate, I think it's brought it to the table of leaders and board members knowing that it's important for an organization to be represented on those channels.
We have to now work in the social media space because that's where people are communicating. This is where they live, so this is where we have to talk to them. So now it's trying to be more engaging, more create a conversation versus just throwing messages at them and hoping they stick.
Communications, whether you're in advertising or PR or media or research or whatever it is you may be doing, is being affected by what's going on in the social spaces. Either because people are using that space to communicate now, brands are looking at it as another channel to use, or what's happening in those channels is being relayed back through advertising and PR.
I think advertising agencies are creating pieces of communication that need to work in all channels, not just the typical media channels. PR, or you call it free, we call it free advertising, journalism, and things like that. That means you've really broken out. So now we're in their world too. So now the PR companies are also starting to walk into our world and create content. And we're creating content to get the journalists to talk about us. So it is mashing together, and it'll be interesting to see where it nets out.
I think every organization can approach social media in its own way. I certainly think that there's probably a potential benefit to every organization out there from being involved in social media. The reality is that not everyone can do everything that they want to do. Everyone's got scarce resources. But I think every organization should at least be listening to what people are saying out there. And that's really step one for social media. Any organizations, listen to what people are saying, listen to who's saying it, and learn from that.
Instinctively, I would say charities have an amazing ability to benefit from social, because charities, while they're about causes for the most part, we're trying to accomplish something, eradicate something, cure something. What I think the real value of charities is, it's about getting people together to do that.
The first thing that a charity typically does is start sending out, when their direct mail goes out, or their e-newsletters go out, or any of their print pieces and that sort of thing, they'll mirror that communication on social media. And then the second step is sort of what everyone's describing as the conversation or the engagement, which is where a charity or a nonprofit realizes that not only can they broadcast out the things that they're already doing on other channels, but then they can have a real-time discussion with their supporters and their followers.
It's because social is about people connecting with people with things that they really care about. Charities, I think, can galvanize that. So while you say they may be a little bit late to the game, it shocks me, because I think the inherent power of social is just exactly what charities have always done, which is galvanize people to get them to do things.
One of the pitfalls that NGOs should be considering when they are starting to adopt social media practices is that just because these tools are free and just because many nonprofits and organizations are using them quite effectively doesn't mean that they have to use them all. I think that a lot of organizations spread themselves very thin and try to be all things to all people on all platforms. And instead, a way to avoid this pitfall is to really prioritize what platforms you want to participate in, use a really focused approach, start setting benchmarks early, and then eventually translating that success to other areas.
Charities should start by thinking about what they want to accomplish. What is their objective? And then how can we use social media to hit that objective? Are you trying to generate more donations? Are you trying to solicit volunteers? Are you trying to enact legislative change or advocacy of some form or another? Each of those different things might have different tools associated with it. So start with the objectives, not with the tools.
I think most marketers are scared of social in general. I don't think it's just charities. I think it's the unknown. They feel like they can't control it. I think you have to let go a little bit in the social space. So I can imagine an organization or an NGO or a charity, they're so sensitive to their messaging that they have to be very careful. So the social space probably scares them because they become a lot more transparent.
If somebody reads something that's either negative or positive about your organization and they start talking about it on social media, that's going to happen whether or not you're in that space. So the very best thing I can say to recommend for organizations is to look to your peers and look to some of the organizations out there that are not afraid to extend their conversation into that space.
The reality that charities have to come to grips with right now is that they don't have control of the message. And it's not a case of losing control. The control is a myth. In the past, we've been able to live with our heads in the sand a little bit and tell ourselves that, we can say things and people are going to believe that. But that really hasn't been the case in the past, and it really isn't the case anymore. The difference is now that when people talk back to you and actually build or expand or argue with what you're saying, many, many other people can hear it. So organizations just have to come to grips with that. Sometimes it's going to be a really great thing, sometimes it's going to cause problems, but it is what it is, and ignoring it means that you're going to be a lot less effective than you could be.
If your organization is frightened to engage on social media, it might be because of the nature of your organization. It might deal with patient information or vulnerable people. You might be concerned, well, how do I deal with somebody who had a negative experience with my organization, and how do I address that on social media? And what I always say is that we can learn best from each other. And in Toronto, especially, we have 3 organizations that Kids Help Phone, CAMH, and Sick Kids Foundation, and they're all very social. They're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, and of course they have those issues too. Patient confidentiality, working with vulnerable people, working with children. Children is a big one. How do I talk to children on social media? And I say, learn from those organizations that are not afraid to play in that social space. So before you move into that space, if you're concerned about those issues, you're concerned about how to maintain your brand messaging, or you're concerned about who should I speak to, or when do I escalate something, I would consider putting together a social media guideline for your organization. There's a great website called socialmediagovernance.com that actually has a database of social media guidelines from many organizations like the American Red Cross and other ones like that, where you can look and see what they've put together as a policy for their employees and as a policy for how employees interact on social media with supporters and followers.
Sometimes we assume that people know what they're doing on the internet. And some people really do know what they're doing. But for a lot of people, it's hit and miss. What we're finding is an intergenerational difference. Children, young people are much more savvy with using Facebook and other social network sites. Doesn't necessarily mean their parents have the same degree of comfort with that. And that leaves a protection gap where young people actually don't know who to turn to when there's a problem arising. And the sort of problems, are generally just about sort of communication, cyberbullying, but also the other extreme would be people who are using social network sites to get access to young people. So I think for NGOs, the question is, don't make assumptions that young people necessarily know the risks. But also don't make assumptions that young people themselves are keeping themselves safe. And don't make assumptions in terms of their own staff, in terms of their knowledge, and how they might support young people in being protective online.